Hey guys, tonight we're drifting quietly into the cold, dim cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at dawn over the English Channel, August 1940. The air smells of leaded fuel and warm rubber, the instrument panel glows soft green, and this, gently, is a story for sleep, not for adrenaline. Welcome in. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. What we're doing together over the next 2 hours and a little more is a long, slow, immersive history of what daily life was actually like for a Luftwaffe pilot during the Second World War. From the secret training fields of the early 1930s all the way through to the burned-out runways of 1945. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this. Tap the little bell too, so the channel can become a quiet companion that drifts back to you each week with another long history to fall asleep to. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading them in the morning. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. You don't need to remember anything tonight. There will be no test, no quiz, no surprise barrel roll. The story will keep flying gently on whether you stay with me or drift off somewhere over the channel. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a small German boy in 1933, standing in a quiet field in Bavaria, looking up as a Jungs-Kaju 52 tri-motor droned overhead, its corrugated metal skin catching the afternoon sun? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to climb the long grass slope of the Wasserkuppe in the Rhone Mountains and learn to fly without an engine, the world reduced to the hush of wind on fabric wings? What did it feel like, do you think, to be handed a black and silver Luftwaffe uniform for the very first time at Wernicken or Schleißheim, and to see yourself in the mirror as somebody new? What was on the breakfast tray before a dawn patrol over Dunkirk? What was the smell of ersatz, coffee and black bread at 4 in the morning when your hands would not quite stop shaking? How did the narrow undercarriage of the Bf 109 feel under your boots on takeoff? That little aircraft that had eaten so many of your friends before they ever reached combat. What did the radio chatter sound like in your headphones over Kent? Voices crackling through the Funkgerät 7, calling out bandits and angels and bearings. What did a wounded comrade's voice sound like through the static when he was very young and very far from home? What did the Russian winter do to engine oil, to skin, to letters from a fiancé? What did the inside of a Stuka feel like in a vertical dive with the Jericho trompete sirens screaming around you like the end of the world? And, more quietly, what does it feel like to be 22 years old, with 60 kills, the Knight's Cross at your throat, and absolutely no idea how this all ends? Tonight, gently, we'll drift through every one of those answers. So, let's begin the slow descent. Imagine the years as soft grey layers of cloud, and you are sinking gently down through them. The 1990s pass beneath you like a thin haze. The 1970s dissolve. The 1950s drift by, smelling faintly of new plastic and old smoke. And then, quietly, you settle into the early 1930s. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1932. The air over Berlin tastes of coal smoke and damp wool. Trams clatter down unter den Linden. The Versailles Treaty still forbids your country an air force. And somewhere in a quiet office, a stout veteran called Hermann Göring is dreaming. You are a thin Bavarian boy in patched trousers, lifting your eyes to the drone of an aircraft passing high overhead. Good luck. That aircraft you can hear, the one whose engine note is making your boy's heart rise into your throat, is almost certainly a civilian machine. Almost. Because in the Germany you have just woken up in, there is no air force at all. Not officially, not on paper, not on any treaty signed in any palace or hall. To understand why a country in the heart of Europe has no air force in 1932, you have to drift back another 14 years. To the wet grey November of 1918, when the Imperial German Luftstreitkräfte, the air service of the Kaiser, simply ceased to exist. At its peak, it had fielded around 20,000 aircraft. It had given the world Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who had been killed in his bright red Fokker triplane on the 21st of April 1918 and buried with full military honours by the Australians who shot him down. It had given the world Ernst Udet, a thin, sardonic young ace with 62 victories who survived the war and came home to a country that no longer wanted heroes. And it had given the world a stout, charming, slightly theatrical fighter pilot called Hermann Göring, the last commander of Jagdgeschwader No. 1, the famous flying circus, who handed his unit's aircraft over to the Allies and watched, quietly furious, as mechanics smashed propellers and slashed fabric on the orders of the victors. And then, on the 28th of June 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German delegation signed a document that, among many other things, forbade their country from possessing any military aviation whatsoever. No bombers, no fighters, no reconnaissance planes, no air force. Not now, not ever. So of course Germany built one anyway, it just had to be quieter about it. The first place that quiet rebellion took root was a long, sloping grass hill in the Rhone Mountains called the Wasserkuppe, where a small group of veterans, students and engineers realized that the treaty had said nothing about engineless aircraft. Gliders, you see. The treaty had not thought of gliders. And so, all through the 1920s, on weekends and summer holidays, German boys hauled fragile contraptions of ash and spruce and varnished linen up that hill, hooked them to enormous bungee cords, and were flung gently into the air to learn, by feel and instinct, the mysterious physics of lift. If you had stood on the Wasserkuppe in, say, the summer of 1926, you would have seen earnest young men in shorts and rolled-up shirt sleeves, walking white-painted sailplanes called Vampire and Professor, and, later, the beloved Grunau baby into position. You would have heard the soft whoosh of release, the sigh of wood and wire, the quiet exhalation of a teenage pilot lifting clear of the earth for the very first time. It looked, to any passing inspector from the Allied Control Commission, like an innocent sport. It was, in fact, a national flying school being constructed in plain sight. The boys who learned at the Wasserkuppe and at hundreds of smaller clubs across the country were enrolled in the Deutsche Luftsportverband, the German Air Sports Association, which sounded like a pleasant amateur hobby and was, with stubborn quiet purpose, the seedbed of the future Luftwaffe. And the seedbed had a sister institution, a commercial one with a brand and a timetable. On the 6th of January 1926, two struggling German airlines were merged into a single national carrier called Deutsche Luft Hansa, and put under the management of a sharp, ambitious former military pilot called Erhard Milch. Lufthansa, as it became, was on its surface exactly what it appeared to be, a perfectly ordinary airline carrying mail and passengers between Berlin and Hamburg and Königsberg. Underneath the surface, it was something else entirely. Its pilots were trained to military standards. Its routes traced strategic lines across Europe. Its aircraft were designed very quietly, with a second life in mind. The Junkers Ju-52 trimotor, that corrugated, slow, beloved workhorse droning over your Bavarian field tonight, could carry passengers today and bombs tomorrow. The sleek Heinkel He-70 was advertised as a fast mailplane and just happened to be a perfect blueprint for a light bomber. The Dornier Do-17, the long, slim aircraft that would later be nicknamed the Flying Pencil, began life as an express mail carrier and ended it dropping bombs on Warsaw. This sort of thing is, if you think about it, a remarkable feat of national double bookkeeping. An entire shadow air force hiding inside a flag carrier, an aviation club, and a model aircraft hobby. But there was one more layer to the secret, and it was hidden far away, in the last place anybody thought to look. In April 1922, in the quiet Italian resort town of Rapallo, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a treaty that quietly reopened diplomatic and economic ties between the two great pariah states of post-war Europe. It was an unlikely friendship, the kind of friendship that forms not because two parties love each other, but because everybody else has stopped speaking to them. Out of the Treaty of Rapallo grew a deeply secret arrangement. The Soviets needed industrial expertise. The Germans needed somewhere to train pilots far from prying Allied eyes. And so, from 1925 until 1933, deep inside Russia, in a small town called Lipetsk, about 300 miles south of Moscow, the Reichswehr ran a secret fighter pilot school. You can picture it if you like. A flat, dusty Russian airfield. A row of Fokker D.13 biplanes painted in plain colors. No German markings anywhere. Young men in unmarked overalls practicing aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery. A handful of mechanics, a handful of instructors, all carrying false papers. They were not officially soldiers. They were not officially anything. And during their years there, around 120 German fighter pilots, plus engineers and observers, were quietly trained on Soviet soil, drinking Russian tea in the evenings, learning the trade that their country had supposedly given up forever. It is, frankly, one of the more astonishing pieces of clandestine cooperation in modern history, and almost nobody has heard of it. Lipetsk closed in 1933. The reason it closed is that, in January of that year, a man called Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany, and the new regime had no further use for hiding things in Russia. They were going to do the hiding at home now, and then, before too long, they would not bother to hide at all. Hitler made Hermann Göring, who in the long lean years had drifted through morphine addiction, exile in Sweden, political pamphleteering, and an unlikely return to influence, his Reich Commissioner for Aviation. Within months, in May 1933, a brand new ministry had been created. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, housed in an enormous stone building on the corner of Wilhelmstrasse and Leipziger Strasse in central Berlin. It had thousands of rooms. It had a vast central courtyard. It had, very quickly, a very busy staff. Officially, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium oversaw civil aviation. Unofficially, it was assembling day by hangar, squadron by squadron, an entire air force. For 2 years, this air force did not exist. There were no badges. There were no uniforms in public. Pilots wore civilian clothes or borrowed army or naval kit. Aircraft factories like Messerschmitt at Augsburg, Heinkel at Rostock, and Junkers at Dessau were churning out designs that were, of course, purely for sport, or purely for export, or purely for research, of course, of course. And then, on the 1st of March 1935, with a kind of theatrical shrug, Germany simply announced that the secret was over. The Luftwaffe officially existed. The Treaty of Versailles, in this respect, was now a piece of paper that had stopped meaning anything. The world protested mildly and did very little. If you had been in Berlin that spring, you would have seen the new uniforms appear in the streets almost overnight. The Luftwaffe wore a soft blue-grey, what the Germans called Tuchblau, with a golden eagle clutching a swastika worn high on the right breast, and on the collar tabs the rank insignia in gleaming wire. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting quietly into the cold, dim cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at dawn over the English Channel, August 1940. The air smells of leaded fuel and warm rubber. The instrument panel glows soft green. And this, gently, is a story for sleep, not for adrenaline. Welcome in. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. What we're doing together over the next 2 hours and a little more is a long, slow, immersive history of what daily life was actually like for a Luftwaffe pilot during the Second World War. From the secret training fields of the early 1930s all the way through to the burned-out runways of 1945. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. Tap the little bell too, so the channel can become a quiet companion that drifts back to you each week with another long history to fall asleep to. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading them in the morning. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. You don't need to remember anything tonight. There will be no test, no quiz, no surprise barrel roll. The story will keep flying gently on whether you stay with me or drift off somewhere over the channel. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a small German boy in 1933, standing in a quiet field in Bavaria, looking up as a Jungs-Kaju 52 tri-motor droned overhead, its corrugated metal skin catching the afternoon sun? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to climb the long grass slope of the Wasserkuppe in the Rhone Mountains and learn to fly without an engine, the world reduced to the hush of wind on fabric wings? What did it feel like, do you think, to be handed a black and silver Luftwaffe uniform for the very first time at Wernicken or Schleißheim, and to see yourself in the mirror as somebody new? What was on the breakfast tray before a dawn patrol over Dunkirk? What was the smell of ersatz, coffee, and black bread at 4 in the morning when your hands would not quite stop shaking? How did the narrow undercarriage of the Bf 109 feel under your boots on takeoff? That little aircraft that had eaten so many of your friends before they ever reached combat. What did the radio chatter sound like in your headphones over Kent? Voices crackling through the Funkgerät 7, calling out bandits and angels and bearings. What did a wounded comrade's voice sound like through the static when he was very young and very far from home? What did the Russian winter do to engine oil, to skin, to letters from a fiancé? What did the inside of a Stuka feel like in a vertical dive with the Jericho trompete sirens screaming around you like the end of the world? And, more quietly, what does it feel like to be 22 years old, with 60 kills, the Knight's Cross at your throat, and absolutely no idea how this all ends? Tonight, gently, we'll drift through every one of those answers. So, let's begin the slow descent. Imagine the years as soft grey layers of cloud, and you are sinking gently down through them. The 1990s pass beneath you like a thin haze. The 1970s dissolve. The 1950s drift by, smelling faintly of new plastic and old smoke. And then, quietly, you settle into the early 1930s. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1932. The air over Berlin tastes of coal smoke and damp wool. Trams clatter down unter den Linden. The Versailles Treaty still forbids your country an air force. And somewhere in a quiet office, a stout veteran called Hermann Göring is dreaming. You are a thin Bavarian boy in patched trousers, lifting your eyes to the drone of an aircraft passing high overhead. Good luck! That aircraft you can hear, the one whose engine note is making your boy's heart rise into your throat, is almost certainly a civilian machine. Almost. Because in the Germany you have just woken up in, there is no air force at all. Not officially, not on paper, not on any treaty signed in any palace or hall. To understand why a country in the heart of Europe has no air force in 1932, you have to drift back another 14 years. To the wet grey November of 1918, when the Imperial German Luftstreitkräfte, the air service of the Kaiser, simply ceased to exist. At its peak, it had fielded around 20,000 aircraft. It had given the world Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who had been killed in his bright red Fokker triplane on the 21st of April 1918, and buried with full military honours by the Australians who shot him down. It had given the world Ernst Udet, a thin, sardonic young ace with 62 victories who survived the war and came home to a country that no longer wanted heroes. And it had given the world a stout, charming, slightly theatrical fighter pilot called Hermann Göring, the last commander of Jagdgeschwader No. 1, the famous flying circus, who handed his unit's aircraft over to the Allies and watched, quietly furious, as mechanics smashed propellers and slashed fabric on the orders of the victors. And then, on the 28th of June 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German delegation signed a document that, among many other things, forbade their country from possessing any military aviation whatsoever. No bombers, no fighters, no reconnaissance planes, no air force. Not now, not ever. So of course Germany built one anyway, it just had to be quieter about it. The first place that quiet rebellion took root was a long, sloping grass hill in the Rhone Mountains called the Wasserkuppe, where a small group of veterans, students and engineers realized that the treaty had said nothing about engineless aircraft. Gliders, you see. The treaty had not thought of gliders. And so, all through the 1920s, on weekends and summer holidays, German boys hauled fragile contraptions of ash and spruce and varnished linen up that hill, hooked them to enormous bungee cords, and were flung gently into the air to learn, by feel and instinct, the mysterious physics of lift. If you had stood on the Wasserkuppe in, say, the summer of 1926, you would have seen earnest young men in shorts and rolled-up shirt sleeves, walking white-painted sailplanes called Vampire and Professor, and, later, the beloved Grunau baby into position. You would have heard the soft whoosh of release, the sigh of wood and wire, the quiet exhalation of a teenage pilot lifting clear of the earth for the very first time. It looked, to any passing inspector from the Allied Control Commission, like an innocent sport. It was, in fact, a national flying school being constructed in plain sight. The boys who learned at the Wasserkuppe and at hundreds of smaller clubs across the country were enrolled in the Deutsche Luftsportverband, the German Air Sports Association, which sounded like a pleasant amateur hobby and was, with stubborn quiet purpose, the seedbed of the future Luftwaffe. And the seedbed had a sister institution, a commercial one with a brand and a timetable. On the 6th of January 1926, two struggling German airlines were merged into a single national carrier called Deutsche Luft Hansa and put under the management of a sharp, ambitious former military pilot called Erhard Milch. Lufthansa, as it became, was on its surface exactly what it appeared to be, a perfectly ordinary airline carrying mail and passengers between Berlin and Hamburg and Königsberg. Underneath the surface, it was something else entirely. Its pilots were trained to military standards. Its routes traced strategic lines across Europe. Its aircraft were designed very quietly, with a second life in mind. The Junkers Ju 52 tri-motor, that corrugated, slow, beloved workhorse droning over your Bavarian field tonight, could carry passengers today and bombs tomorrow. The sleek Heinkel He-70 was advertised as a fast mail plane and just happened to be a perfect blueprint for a light bomber. The Dornier Do-17, the long, slim aircraft that would later be nicknamed the Flying Pencil, began life as an express mail carrier and ended it dropping bombs on Warsaw. This sort of thing is, if you think about it, a remarkable feat of national double bookkeeping. An entire shadow air force hiding inside a flag carrier, an aviation club, and a model aircraft hobby. But there was one more layer to the secret, and it was hidden far away, in the last place anybody thought to look. In April 1922, in the quiet Italian resort town of Rapallo, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a treaty that quietly reopened diplomatic and economic ties between the two great pariah states of post-war Europe. It was an unlikely friendship, the kind of friendship that forms not because two parties love each other, but because everybody else has stopped speaking to them. Out of the Treaty of Rapallo grew a deeply secret arrangement. The Soviets needed industrial expertise. The Germans needed somewhere to train pilots far from prying Allied eyes. And so, from 1925 until 1933, deep inside Russia, in a small town called Lipetsk, about 300 miles south of Moscow, the Reichswehr ran a secret fighter pilot school. You can picture it if you like. A flat, dusty Russian airfield. A row of Fokker D.13 biplanes painted in plain colors. No German markings anywhere. Young men in unmarked overalls practicing aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery. A handful of mechanics, a handful of instructors, all carrying false papers. They were not officially soldiers. They were not officially anything. And during their years there, around 120 German fighter pilots, plus engineers and observers, were quietly trained on Soviet soil, drinking Russian tea in the evenings, learning the trade that their country had supposedly given up forever. It is, frankly, one of the more astonishing pieces of clandestine cooperation in modern history, and almost nobody has heard of it. Lipetsk closed in 1933. The reason it closed is that, in January of that year, a man called Adolf Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany, and the new regime had no further use for hiding things in Russia. They were going to do the hiding at home now, and then, before too long, they would not bother to hide at all. Hitler made Hermann Göring, who in the long lean years had drifted through morphine addiction, exile in Sweden, political pamphleteering, and an unlikely return to influence, his Reich Commissioner for Aviation. Within months, in May 1933, a brand new ministry had been created. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the Reich Aviation Ministry, housed in an enormous stone building on the corner of Wilhelmstrasse and Leipziger Straße in central Berlin. It had thousands of rooms. It had a vast central courtyard. It had, very quickly, a very busy staff. Officially, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium oversaw civil aviation. Unofficially, it was assembling day by hangar, squadron by squadron, an entire air force. For 2 years, this air force did not exist. There were no badges. There were no uniforms in public. Pilots wore civilian clothes or borrowed army or naval kit. Aircraft factories like Messerschmitt at Augsburg, Heinkel at Rostock, and Junkers at Dessau were churning out designs that were, of course, purely for sport, or purely for export, or purely for research, of course. And then, on the 1st of March 1935, with a kind of theatrical shrug, Germany simply announced that the secret was over. The Luftwaffe officially existed. The Treaty of Versailles, in this respect, was now a piece of paper that had stopped meaning anything. The world protested mildly and did very little. If you had been in Berlin that spring, you would have seen the new uniforms appear in the streets almost overnight. The Luftwaffe wore a soft blue-grey, what the Germans called Tuchblau, with a golden eagle clutching a swastika worn high on the right breast, and on the collar tabs the rank insignia in gleaming wirework. To a young man of 17 or 18 looking up from his bicycle, it was the most beautiful uniform he had ever seen. The men running this new force were a strange and uneven mix. There was Goering at the top, vast, vain, brilliant in flashes, lazy in the spaces between. There was Erhard Milch as State Secretary, tireless, abrasive, the actual administrator who built the thing from the ground up while Goering posed for photographs. There was Walther Wever, the first chief of the General Staff of the Luftwaffe, a quiet, deeply thoughtful officer who, alone among the senior leadership, genuinely understood that the future of air power lay in long-range strategic bombing, and who pushed for a 4-engine heavy bomber program called the Ural Bomber. Wever, tragically, climbed into a Heinkel He-70 at Dresden-Klotsche on the 3rd of June 1936, took off without removing the gust lock on the ailerons, and was killed in the crash. With him, in many ways, died the Luftwaffe's strategic conscience. And there was Ernst Udet, the World War I ace with 62 victories, the stunt pilot, the cartoonist, the bon vivant, who was given the entirely unsuitable job of head of aircraft development and procurement. Udet was charming, talented, terrible at administration, and besotted with the dive bomber concept after seeing American Curtiss Helldivers in flight. He would push the Junkers Jew 87 Stuka into the heart of Luftwaffe doctrine. He would also, in 1941, exhausted and disillusioned, take his own life with a pistol while writing a final note to Goering. But that is a sadness for later. For now, in 1935 and 1936, the new Luftwaffe rolled out its first true frontline aircraft, the Heinkel He-51 biplane fighter, the Arado R-68, the Junkers Ju-52 transport. New cadets stood on the parade ground at Doberitz, west of Berlin, in their crisp Tuchblau, and swore a personal oath, not to the Constitution, not to the country, but to Adolf Hitler himself by name. The smell on those parade grounds was of polish and fresh wool, and the dope drying on the new fabric of training aircraft on the far side of the field. The sound was of boots on gravel and the click of a propeller being hand-swung on a cold morning. And then, in July 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain, and Hitler quietly offered General Franco a small, deniable group of pilots and aircraft to help him along. They called it the Legion Condor. The pilots wore civilian clothes when they boarded ships at Hamburg. They were given Spanish-sounding pseudonyms. Among them, learning their trade, were young men whose names you will hear again tonight. Werner Mölders, Adolf Galland, Wolfgang Falk, future legends, getting their first taste of combat over Guernica and Madrid in aircraft that officially were not theirs, in a war that officially was not Germany's. The shadow had stepped very quietly into the daylight, and it was about to grow much longer. So let us follow one of those young men. Not Mölders, not Galland, not yet. Just a boy, any boy. Picture him, perhaps, at the age of 10, in a small town somewhere in Saxony or the Rhineland or East Prussia, in 1936 or 37, kneeling on the floor of his bedroom with a half-built balsa wood model of a Heinkel He-51 in his hands and a tin of glue open beside him on the floorboards. The glue smells sharp and vinegary. The wood smells faintly sweet. Outside his window, a banner is hanging from the town hall and a Junkers Ju-52 is droning across the sky on its way from Berlin to Cologne, and he has stopped what he is doing to listen. This is, in its quiet way, the very first lesson of his pilot training. Because the new Germany had quickly understood something that older nations had not. If you wanted an air force, you did not start with cadets. You started with children. The organization that took him in hand was called the Flieger Hitlerjugend, the Flying Hitler Youth, a dedicated branch of the wider Hitler Youth movement devoted entirely to aviation. By the time he was 14, our boy was building bigger models, properly engineered ones with rib spacing and dihedral angles and tissue covering, and he was being graded on them. By the time he was 15, he was at a glider field on a weekend, wearing a brown shirt, a black neckerchief, and the dark blue winter flying overalls of the Flieger HJ, and he was learning, with the patience that only repetition can teach, how to fly without an engine. Above the flying Hitler Youth, gathering in the older boys and the young men, sat the National Sozialistisches Fliegerkorps, the National Socialist Flyers Corps, the NSFK, run with brisk enthusiasm by an older Great War seaplane ace called Friedrich Christiansen. The NSFK wore a yellow and brown uniform that was frankly hideous, and its members were frankly devoted. They ran the gliding clubs. They organized the bungee cord launches off grass slopes. They handed out the famous A, B, and C glider certificates that you needed to progress. And they set the rhythm of an entire generation's first encounter with the sky. The standard glider was the Grunau Baby, a single-seat, simple, forgiving little open cockpit machine of wood and fabric, with a long, slender wing and a cockpit so narrow your shoulders touched both sides. You launched her with a long, elastic bungee cord. 2 teams of boys hauling on the cord like a tug of war while you sat in the cockpit gripping the stick. And at the command, the cord released its tension and pinged you forward and into the air with a swoosh and a sudden silence. You could feel on a Grunau Baby the smallest shift of air against your wings. Pilots who learned this way developed, in their hands and in their inner ear, what the older instructors called Fingerspitzengefühl, a fingertip sense of the aircraft. It was, genuinely, one of the most thorough natural flight educations any nation's pilots had ever received. By the time our boy was 17 or 18 and ready to apply formally for the Luftwaffe, he had already flown 100 or more times. He arrived at his medical examination at a Fliegerärztliche Untersuchungsstelle, a flight medical center, with a glider license in his pocket and his Aryan-Nachweis, his certificate of Aryan ancestry, neatly folded beside it. The medical was thorough and unforgiving. They checked his eyesight, demanding 6/6 vision in both eyes. They checked his height. They checked his teeth, his ears, his lungs, his heart, the function of his inner ear on a slowly rotating chair. They asked about his parents and grandparents. They asked about his schooling. They asked, somehow, about everything. If he passed, he reported, with a small cardboard suitcase to a Flugenwärter company, a recruit training company, at a base like Salzwedel or Wild Park Werder. And here, with a force that surprised every young man who had imagined the Luftwaffe to be a romantic flying brotherhood, the Luftwaffe became the army for 6 months. He was given a rifle. He was given grey overalls. He was marched. He was shouted at. He was made to crawl through mud, to dig holes, to clean a latrine, to disassemble and reassemble a Mauser 98 rifle in the dark. He learned to salute, to fold a blanket so tightly it could be balanced on its edge, to polish boots until he could see his face in them. He sat through long evening lectures on National Socialist ideology, on the history of the German people, on the meaning of the oath he had taken to Adolf Hitler, personally, by name, on the parade ground of his depot. He did not, in those 6 months, see an aircraft up close. Luftwaffe wanted soldiers first and pilots second. When he finally moved on, the change was sudden and intoxicating. He arrived at his A and B school, his elementary flying school, often at a place like Schleißheim, just north of Munich, where the air smelled of cut grass and the warm oil of running engines, and where the apron held rows of small, brightly painted training biplanes that looked like they belonged in a pre-war air show. The WW131 Jungmann, a beautiful, agile 2-seat biplane, with the cadet in the front cockpit and the instructor in the back. The Focke-Wulf FW44 Stieglitz, the Goldfinch, equally pretty, slightly more forgiving. The low-wing Clem Kell 35, for those who showed an early aptitude for monoplanes. He flew them on grass, in open cockpits, in a leather flying helmet, whose chin straps left a permanent crease in the skin under his jaw, in goggles that frosted in winter and stuck to his sweat in summer. The curriculum was unhurried and complete. He learned takeoffs and landings, hundreds of them, until they became as automatic as walking. He learned stalls, the tremor of the airframe before the wing gave up, the gentle nose drop, the recovery. He learned spins, deliberately entered and deliberately broken. He learned aerobatics, loops and rolls, and Immelmann turns. He learned navigation by compass, by clock, by railway line, by river bend, the old discipline of dead reckoning. He learned formation flying, his wingtip an arm's length from another aircraft's wingtip, both pilots concentrating so hard their teeth ached. If he passed his B examination, he moved on to the C schule for advanced training, often on the Arado R-96, a low-wing monoplane with retractable undercarriage that began to look and feel something like a real fighter. From the C schule, he was assessed and streamed. The bright, instinctive pilots, the ones with quick hands and good eyes, were sent to the Jagdfliegerschule, the fighter pilot school at Werneuchen near Berlin, or back at Schleißheim. The careful, methodical pilots, the ones who liked instruments and procedures, went to bomber schools or reconnaissance schools. The exceptional all-rounders sometimes went to night fighter or instructor courses. At the Jagdfliegerschule he met, finally, his Bf 109, and the aircraft that would carry him through the war, that would make him an experte or kill him, made an immediate and not entirely flattering first impression. She was small, low-slung, with a tiny cockpit and a long, sharply pointed nose that obscured nearly everything ahead on the ground. Her undercarriage was attached not to the wings but to the fuselage, splaying outward at an alarming angle, and the track between her wheels was famously narrow, just under 2 meters. On a grass field in a crosswind, she was a beast. She would, with the slightest provocation, swing on takeoff and try, with stubborn enthusiasm, to ground loop herself into a wreck. Schools at Wernicken and elsewhere wrote off Bf-109s by the dozen, and student pilots washed out by the dozen with them. The men who survived the Jagdfliegerschul's first weeks tended to walk a little straighter afterwards, having genuinely earned it. He was sent for gunnery training to Bad Aibling, in the foothills of the Bavarian Alps, where he learned to fire his guns at a fabric drogue towed behind another aircraft, learning the lead and deflection that would, one day, put bullets into a moving Spitfire or a Polikarpov. He was sent for blind flying, instrument flying, to Neubiberg, where the rear cockpit of a 2-seat trainer was covered with a black canvas hood, and he learned to trust the artificial horizon and the turn-and-bank indicator and the altimeter when his eyes told him nothing useful at all. And in the long evenings between exhausting days, he lived a life that those who survived would remember for the rest of their lives with a kind of unbearable fondness. The casino, the officers' mess, was the heart of every base. He ate his black bread and his sausage and his ersatz coffee made from roasted barley at long wooden tables. He sang with the others the old songs and the new ones, the ones about flying and the ones about girls and the ones about both. He drank thin beer, he played cards, he wrote letters home. He fell, often, in love with the daughter of the local mayor or the postmistress or a girl he saw once on a tram in Munich and never forgot. The casino smelled of pipe smoke and beer and wet wool and floor polish, and on the wall hung a portrait of the Führer and another of Manfred von Richthofen, and the cadets did not, on the whole, find this combination strange. When he passed his final examinations, there was a quiet, formal ceremony. He was handed his Flugzeugführerabzeichen, his pilot's badge in gleaming silver, an eagle in flight clutching a swastika in its talons within an oval wreath. He pinned it to his left breast pocket of his Tuschblau tunic, just below the eagle on the right. He looked at himself in the mirror of the ablutions block and saw, looking back, a Luftwaffe pilot. He was perhaps 20 years old. This pipeline, this beautiful, careful, expensive pipeline that took a boy from a model aircraft on his bedroom floor to a Bf-109 cockpit at 20, worked superbly while Germany still had time, and fuel, and competent instructors, and the patience to use them all properly. Through 1939 and 1940 and 1941, a new Luftwaffe pilot arrived at his frontline unit with somewhere between 150 and 250 hours in his logbook, much of it in advanced types, a great deal of it in the Bf-109 itself. He was, by any standard of the period, exceptionally well trained. By 1943, the strain was beginning to show. By 1944, it had become a quiet catastrophe. The fuel that would have flown him on training sorties was being hoarded for combat. The instructors who would have taught him had been pulled to the front, and many of them had been killed there. The schools were being bombed. The hours dropped to 100, then to less. By the last winter of the war, 18-year-olds were arriving at frontline Geschwaden with barely enough flight time to understand the cockpit, expected to fight Mustangs flown by Americans with 300 hours and an instructor's patient confidence. They did not, on the whole, last long. But in the summer, he received his orders. Our young man knew nothing of that future. He was 20. He was in the most beautiful uniform any tailor had ever cut. He had wings on his chest. He had passed every test the Reich could devise. And in his hand, that morning, was an envelope, freshly typed, posting him to a frontline Jagdgeschwader, somewhere over there, just beyond the western horizon, where a real war was about to begin. He folded the orders into his breast pocket, took the slow train east, and arrived at his Geschwader sometime in the late summer of 1939, when the air over Germany felt thick and watchful, and when the older pilots in the casino had stopped singing quite so loudly in the evenings. He was assigned to a Staffel, a squadron of about 12 aircraft, and given a wingman position, the Rot 2 slot, where his only job was to stick to his Rottenführer's tail and watch the sky behind him. He was given a locker, a bunk, a parachute fitted to his back, and a strip of cloth on which his name was stitched in Gothic letters. He was given, on a clear evening in late August, a sealed envelope to be opened only on order. And then, on the first morning of September, very early, before the dew had lifted from the grass, he was woken by an orderly with a flashlight, told the war had begun, and walked out into a darkness that smelled of fuel and cut hay and the faint diesel of warming starter trolleys. At 4:34 in the morning on September the 1st, 1939, the very first bombs of the Second World War in Europe fell on the railway bridge at Tascha, which the Germans called Dürschau, dropped by 3 Junkers 87 Stukas of the 3rd Staffel of Sturzkampfgeschwader, one under a young lieutenant named Bruno Dilly. The bridge was the only rail crossing of the Vistula in that sector, and the Stukas went in low, beneath the level of the parapet, hoping to cut the demolition wires before the Polish engineers could blow the spans. They missed. The Poles got the charges off, but the war had, with that first quiet rush of falling iron, begun. By dawn, 1,100 Luftwaffe aircraft were in the air. Heinkel, He-111s, and Dornier Do-17s of Luftflotte, 1 in the north, and Luftflotte 4 in the south, crossed the border at low level, hunting Polish airfields, rail junctions, troop columns, telephone exchanges. Bf-109s of Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26 and others swept ahead and above. And the Stukas, with their fixed spattered undercarriage and their inverted gull wings, fell on Polish positions with a sound that no one who heard it ever entirely forgot. That sound, the wail of the Jericho trompete, the trumpet of Jericho, was a small siren bolted to the leg fairing of each Stuka, driven by a tiny propeller that spun faster as the aircraft dived. It was, in cold engineering terms, completely useless. It produced no military effect. It only made noise. But the noise, a rising mechanical scream that climbed in pitch as the bomb came closer, was designed for one purpose: to terrify the men on the ground. And it did that work with a thoroughness that frightened even the pilots dropping it. The Stuka pilot, strapped tightly into his cockpit with the dive brakes deployed, and the airframe trembling and the altimeter unwinding past 3,000 meters, 2,000, 1,000, was very nearly upside down, looking through the floor window between his knees at a Polish gun emplacement, growing rapidly larger, while the siren outside his canopy howled like something not quite of this world. He pickled his bomb at perhaps 450 meters. He pulled out, blacking briefly grey at the edges of his vision under 6G, and climbed away into a sky already streaked with smoke. He did this on a busy day 6 or 7 times. the Polish Air Force, the Lotnictwo Wojskowe, fought with a stubborn courage that the Germans rarely acknowledged in their own accounts. Its main fighter was the Pzel P-11, a high-winged, gull-shaped monoplane that had been advanced in 1933 and was hopelessly outdated by 1939. Its pilots took it up anyway, against Bf-109s that flew 100 kilometers an hour faster, and they shot down, somehow, nearly 130 German aircraft before they were finally overwhelmed. The legend that the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground in the first hours is one of the war's neater myths. It was not. It was destroyed in the air, slowly over weeks, while it fought. Our young pilot, in those weeks, learned what war actually felt like. He learned that his hands shook for an hour after his first combat. He learned that the smell of cordite leaking from the breech of his MG-17s into a hot cockpit was sweet and metallic and made him slightly sick. He learned that the radio, the Funkgerät 7, mostly produced static and shouting, and that the calm voice of his Staffelkapitän cutting through the static was the most welcome sound in the world. He slept in a tent on a captured Polish grass field, ate from a Feldkusch field kitchen ladle that smelled permanently of cabbage, soup and fat, washed in a canvas basin, and wrote home letters that were heavily and cheerfully censored. By the end of September, Poland was finished, and the Geschwader was rotated west, toward the Rhine, toward the long, strange winter that the Western Allies would call the Phony War, and the Germans the Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. That winter was cold and quiet. He flew patrols along the western frontier, occasionally tangling with French Marines or RAF Hurricanes over the Saar. But mostly he sat in the dispersal hut, drank ersatz coffee, played skat at a small folding table, and waited. The waiting ended in April. Operation Weserübung, the seizure of Denmark and Norway, opened on the 9th of April, 1940, and within hours the Luftwaffe carried out the first true airborne assault in history. Dropping Fallschirmjäger from Junkers Ju-52 transports onto Sola Airfield outside Stavanger, and at Aalborg, and at Oslo. Bf-110 Zastura, the heavy twin-engined destroyer fighter, escorted bombers across the cold grey North Sea, while Heinkel 111s hunted Royal Navy ships among the fjords. The campaign was short, brutal, and largely successful, though the Kriegsmarine paid a price the German fleet would never recover from. For the Luftwaffe, Norway was a rehearsal. The real performance opened on the morning of the 10th of May. Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of the Low Countries and France, began before dawn, with formations of He-111s, Do-17s, and the new, fast, slim Junkers Ju-88s, blackening the sky over airfields he had taken off from in his training days, climbing west into a morning that would change everything. He flew that morning from a base near Cologne, escorting bombers toward Belgian airfields and looking down through breaks in the cloud he could see, on the roads below, the long grey columns of the Wehrmacht, and ahead of them, in places he could not yet see but could imagine, the audacity that would define the campaign. At the fortress of Eben-Emael, on the Albert Canal, 78 Fallschirmjäger, under a young lieutenant named Walter Koch, arrived in DFS 230 gliders, cast off in silence at altitude over German territory, and gliding the rest of the way, settling onto the grass roof of one of the most modern fortifications in Europe. They placed shaped charges, the new hollow charge weapons that no one outside Germany yet understood, on the gun cupolas, and within 20 hours they had reduced a fortress of 1,200 men to surrender. It was the kind of operation that, when described later in the casino over schnapps, made even the older pilots shake their heads and laugh, half in admiration and half in disbelief. In the air, meanwhile, our young pilot was learning what real fighter combat looked like. He was flying the Bf-109E, the Emil, with 2 MG-17 machine guns in the cowl and 2 MG F-20mm cannon in the wings. And he was tangling with French Morane-Saulnier 406s and Dewoitine 520 fighters, with Belgian Hurricanes, with the first Spitfires that came out over Dunkirk in late May. He saw, from a distance, the work of pilots like Werner Mulders, who had pioneered the Schwarm Finger 4 formation in Spain and was now leading by example with a quiet, almost professorial intensity. He saw Adolf Galland, with his cigar and his swagger, racking up victories with Jagdgeschwader 27. He heard the name Wilhelm Balthasar over and over on the radio, the tireless killer of French aircraft. He saw, too, that the Luftwaffe was not invincible. On the 5th of June, Mulders himself was shot down by a French Dewoitine pilot, René Pommier-Lerage, and spent 3 weeks as a prisoner of the French before the armistice freed him. Even the best could fall. He flew over Dunkirk in late May and early June, while the British Expeditionary Force evacuated, watching the smoke pillar from burning oil tanks rise 20,000 feet into the sky, watching the long lines of men on the beaches below, watching small boats moving like beetles across the Channel water. The Luftwaffe was supposed to finish them. It did not. The weather closed in. The Spitfires came out, and 338,000 men got away, in a defeat that would, in time, become one of Britain's most stubborn legends. On the 3rd of June came Operation Paula, a great strike against the airfields and aviation factories around Paris, hundreds of aircraft converging on the French capital in broad daylight. He flew his Bf-109 over the Eiffel Tower at 6,000 meters and looked down at a city that 2 weeks later would be German. When the armistice was signed at Compiègne on the 22nd of June, in the same railway carriage in which Germany had signed its own surrender, 22 years earlier, his Geschwader moved forward to a captured French airfield on the Channel coast, somewhere between Calais and Boulogne. The grass was thick and green. The hangars were intact. The local chateau had been requisitioned as the officers' quarters, and on his first evening there, a French steward, whose face revealed nothing, brought him a small glass of cognac and a plate of soft camembert and a piece of bread that was not, for the first time in months, made of war flour. He sat on a stone terrace and watched the sun set over a flat field of poppies, and beyond them, across a strip of grey water just visible on the horizon, the white cliffs of England. He had 2 iron crosses, second class and first class, pinned to his tunic. He had 4 confirmed victories. He was perhaps 21 years old. He was very tired and very pleased with himself, and very confident that the next campaign would be quick. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him over those white cliffs. What was waiting for him in the calm and methodical mind of Adolf Hitler was something called Führerweisung Nummer 17, Directive Number 17, signed on the 16th of July 1940. It instructed the Luftwaffe to overpower the Royal Air Force in the shortest possible time, so that an invasion of England, codenamed Unternehmen Seelöwe, Operation Sea Lion, could cross a channel free of British air power. It was a directive that on paper looked entirely plausible. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland in 5 weeks. It had crushed France in 6. England was a small island with, The intelligence officers said, perhaps 600 fighters left after Dunkirk. The math in the casino at Wissant looked good. The math was wrong, but he did not know that yet. His new home was one of a string of forward fighter bases scattered along the Pas de Calais, names that would become quietly famous in the histories. Wissant, Cafiers, Coquelles, Marquise, Audenberg. They were not, by the standards of a peacetime Luftwaffe airfield, real bases at all. They were strips of pasture, with the Bf-109s parked in revetments cut into hedges and draped under camouflage netting, woven with strips of green and brown cloth, with the ground crew sleeping in tents, and the pilots quartered in nearby villas and farmhouses, requisitioned from their owners with a politeness that everyone understood was not really politeness. Jagdgeschwader 2, Jagdgeschwader 26, Jagdgeschwader 51, 52, 53. They sat there in the long, warm summer of 1940 and they waited for the order. The order, when it came, structured a day that would repeat itself for weeks until it became indistinguishable from a fever dream. He was woken at 4 in the morning by an orderly with a tin mug of ersatz coffee. He pulled on his channel hose, the long leather flight trousers with the map pocket on the thigh, and over them his yellow Schwimm Wester, the inflatable life vest the pilots called the May West, because the channel was cold and a man without one drowned inside 15 minutes. He went to the operations tent, where the Gruppenkommandeur stood at a map under the dim light of a blackout lamp and traced, with a wooden pointer, the route, the rendezvous, the target, the expected fighter opposition. Then he walked out across damp grass to his aircraft. The armourers were just finishing loading the wing cannon, the 20mm MGFF that fired 60 rounds per gun before it was empty, and the cowl machine guns, the 7.92 MG-17s with 1,000 rounds each. The mechanics had topped up the B4 fuel and the glycol coolant, and the engine had been warmed and shut down again, and the cockpit smelled of warm leather and oil, and faintly of the previous pilot's sweat, because there were never quite enough aircraft for one each. He climbed in, he buckled the harness, he pulled on his oxygen mask, and he taxied, weaving, because the long nose of the Emil meant he could not see straight ahead, out to the grass strip and into the air. The formation he flew was not the rigid 3-aircraft V that the British and the French still used. The Luftwaffe had learned better in Spain, where Werner Mulders and a handful of others had worked out that the natural fighting unit was a pair, a rot, of leader and wingman, and that 2 pairs together formed a schwarm, 4 aircraft spaced wide apart at slightly different altitudes, each man's eyes covering the gap behind the others. The British, watching, would copy it within a year and call it the Finger 4. By that point, of course, it had cost them. He climbed through the morning haze toward Cap Grisnez, watching the white contrails of his schwarm draw 4 parallel lines across the sky. At 6,000 meters, the air was thin and bitterly cold, and the electric heating in his suit, which never worked very well, did not work at all today, so his fingers in their leather gauntlets went slowly numb on the control column. He crossed the coast. He looked down at the grey-green strip of water below and tried not to think about it. The fight, when it came fast. Spitfires diving from above, the way Spitfires always seemed to dive from above, because the British radar chain along the coast, at places like Pevensey and Ventnor, had told them exactly where to be and exactly when. He saw Tracer crawl past his canopy in lazy-looking arcs that were not lazy at all. He heard the cracking sound of cannon strikes on metal somewhere, and could not tell at first whether it was his aircraft or the one ahead of him. He smelled cordite, sharp and sweet, leaking into the cockpit from his own guns. He pulled into a tight turn, blacked grey, and came out behind something, a hurricane perhaps, and fired, and missed, and fired again, and watched a small piece of fabric tear from the enemy's wing and flutter away. And then, always, the fuel gauge. The Bf-109, beloved as it was, had been designed for the defense of Central Europe, not for a strategic offensive across an ocean. With full tanks and economical cruising, it could fly perhaps 600 kilometers. From Wissant to London and back was already most of that. By the time he was over Kent, with combat throttle pushed forward and the engine drinking fuel at twice its cruising rate, he had perhaps 20 minutes before he had to turn for home. And that 20 minutes was not negotiable. The bombers he was supposed to be escorting did not understand this, or did not want to. They watched their fighter cover wave and break away and turn east, and they continued alone into the waiting Spitfires, and they died. The dates piled up like leaves. Adlertag, Eagle Day, the 13th of August, when the great offensive was supposed to break fighter command in a single afternoon and did not. The hardest day, the 18th of August, when both sides lost more aircraft than on any other day of the battle. And then, on the 7th of September, the shift everyone above the rank of Staffelkapitän understood was a mistake. The shift from attacking the airfields and the raid stations to bombing London itself, in retaliation for a small RAF raid on Berlin. Black Saturday, the East End, burning from the river to the docks. And then the 15th of September, Battle of Britain Day, when the Luftwaffe sent its largest raid yet, and the RAF, which according to German intelligence should already have been finished, met it with what looked, from 6,000 meters up, like every fighter in the world. He came back from that day, and the day after, and the day after that with the same sequence of small shocks. The walk across the grass to the dispersal hut, the roll call, taken quietly with long pauses where names should have been and were not. The empty chairs in the casino at dinner, the ones the orderlies somehow always forgot to remove. The phonograph someone wound up to play Lal Anderson singing Lily Marlene, that slow, sad song about a girl and a lantern outside a barracks gate, which all of them, including the men who had no one waiting for them, listened to in silence. The other song, Heimat deine Stern, Your Homeland Stars, which made several of them, after enough cognac, very quietly cry. He wrote letters. He wrote to his mother in Bavaria and told her the weather was fine and the food was excellent, both lies. He wrote to a girl in Augsburg, whose photograph he kept in his breast pocket, and told her about a French village market and the color of the poppies, leaving out everything else. He went to bed at 11 and lay awake until 2, listening to the distant rumble of the night bombers crossing the coast, and he thought about Helmut Wick of Jagdgeschwader 2, who had become Geschwader Commodore at 25 and had been the leading German ace at the moment he was shot down into the Channel on the 28th of November. His body never recovered. He thought about Mulders, who had been freed from the French and was now somehow already at 50 victories and pushing for 60, with a quiet, exhausted look in his eyes whenever he visited a forward base. He thought about Galland, the new Commodore of Jagdgeschwader 26, who, when Goering asked him in person what he needed to win the battle, had reportedly answered, with the kind of calm insolence that only Galland could manage and survive, that he needed a group of Spitfires. He thought, more than anything, about the bomber crews, the men of Kampfgeschwader 2 and 3 of 26 and 53, in their Heinkels and Dorniers and Junkers, lumbering across the channel at 4,000 meters in tight defensive boxes, waiting for the Spitfires to come. He had seen, with his own eyes, a Heinkel 111 simply come apart in the air under cannon fire, the wing folding upward like a closing book, the fuselage tumbling. He had seen parachutes that did not open, and parachutes that did open and drifted slowly down toward water that the Seenoorddienst rescue Heinkel 59 floatplanes, painted white with red crosses and shot at by both sides, would sometimes reach in time and sometimes not. By the end of September, there was a word for what was happening to him and to his friends. The doctors called it Kanalkrankheit, channel sickness. It looked, depending on the man, like a tremor in the hands that would not stop, or like a sudden inability to eat, or like a 1,000-yard stare across the breakfast table, or, in the worst cases, like a man who walked out to his aircraft one morning, sat in the cockpit, and quietly refused to start the engine. The official line was that Kanalkrankheit was a failure of National Socialist will. The unofficial line, which the squadron doctors at Wissant and Ordembert quietly accepted, was that human beings were not built to fly across cold salt water 4 times a day for 3 months, while their friends disappeared one by one beneath it. On the 17th of September, in a directive that almost no frontline pilot saw at the time, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The reasons given were operational: the weather, the unsuitability of barges, the lateness of the season. The real reason, the reason he and his comrades had been writing into the casualty returns all summer, was that Fighter Command was still flying, and the Luftwaffe could not protect its bombers in daylight any longer. So the bombers shifted to night, and the long, grinding ordeal of the Blitz began. And the daylight fighter pilots, those of them still alive, were sent home for a few weeks of leave that they spent in a kind of grey-edged silence that their families did not understand. He sat on a train heading east in October of 1940 with the Iron Cross First Class on his tunic and 7 kills in his logbook, and a slow, dawning, very private understanding that he and his friends had not in fact won. They had simply, somehow, been ordered to stop. And the next thing they would be ordered to do, whatever it was, would have to be done with the men who were left. The next thing, as it turned out, was something almost no one in that train compartment could have imagined, even though the maps were already being drawn in Berlin. The leave ended. The autumn passed. The winter of 40 and 41 was spent on rest bases in Germany and on coastal patrols, and on the strange, half-real campaigns of the Balkans and Yugoslavia and Greece, which seemed almost pleasant after the Channel, because the enemy fighter forces there were small and the skies were warm. And then, in the late spring of 1941, the orders came that moved entire Geschwader east, by train and by transport aircraft, into Poland and East Prussia, into staging areas with names like Suwałki and Tilsit and Brest-Litovsk, where ground crews unloaded crates of spares and erected camouflage netting and were told nothing, but knew anyway, the way soldiers always know that something enormous was coming. It came at 3:15 in the morning on the 22nd of June, 1941. 2,770 Luftwaffe aircraft along an 1,800-mile front that ran from the Baltic to the Black Sea. By the end of that first day, more than 1,800 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed, the great majority of them on the ground, lined up wingtip to wingtip on their airfields like a kind of accidental gift. Because Stalin, somehow, had refused to believe what was about to happen until the bombs were already falling on Brest, you took off in your Bf 109F, the new model, sleeker and rounder than the angular Emil, with its single 20mm cannon firing through the propeller boss, and you flew east into a sunrise that did not seem to end, and you came back to a strip you had never seen before, and you taxied past the smoking wrecks of biplanes you could not even identify, and your fitter handed you a tin cup of coffee and said quietly that they had broken 7 airfields today. For about 2 months, in the long summer of 41, it felt almost like a kind of dream. The Wehrmacht moved east faster than anyone had thought possible. Panzergruppe Guderian punched through the Pripyat marshes. Smolensk fell. Kiev was encircled. From your cockpit, at 1,500 meters, you could see, on a clear day, columns of smoke rising every few kilometers along the horizon, marking the burning T-34s that the Stukas of Sturzkampfgeschwader II had caught on the roads. On the 23rd of September, a Stuka pilot named Hans Ulrich Rudel, then 25 years old and unknown, dove on the Soviet battleship Marat as it lay at anchor at Kronstadt outside Leningrad, planted a 1,000-kilogram bomb directly into its forward magazine and broke the ship in half. The newsreels at home played it over and over. Rudel, who looked like a slightly shy schoolteacher and did not drink and did not smoke, went on to fly 2,530 combat sorties before the war ended, destroy more than 500 tanks, lose a leg to anti-aircraft fire, and remain, until his death decades later in Argentina, the most decorated and least repentant German pilot of the war. But the dream began to crack almost as soon as it started. The distances. First, the map of European Russia is not the map of France. From your forward base at, say, Bobruisk, the next decent target lay 300 kilometers east, and the one after that another 300, and the one after that another. The Bf 109, that beautiful short-legged interceptor, had to be hung with drop tanks just to escort the Heinkels and the Junkers 88s as far as Smolensk, and even then it was always nearly out of fuel by the time the bombers found their target. The bombers themselves were too small. The medium twin-engined types designed for tactical support of an army that was advancing 20 kilometers a day, not for the strategic crushing of a country 8 time zones wide. The Luftwaffe in 1941 was, in cold truth, a magnificent tactical air force trying to do a strategic job for which it had never been built. And then there was the ground itself. In summer, the Russian airfields were not airfields at all, but grass strips scraped out of pine forests, and the dust kicked up by every takeoff and landing, fine and abrasive as flour, ate the engines from the inside out. Mechanics rebuilt cylinders and changed oil filters under canvas tents, while you slept on a straw pallet in a wooden hut that had been a Soviet schoolhouse a fortnight earlier. In autumn came the Rasputitsa, the season of Rasputitsa, the season of mud, when the unpaved roads of European Russia turned, almost overnight, into a kind of brown porridge 2 feet deep, swallowing tractors and fuel trucks and supply columns, and on more than one occasion, entire aircraft that had been parked at the wrong end of a strip. Plank walkways were laid between huts. Men's boots came off in the mud. Engines refused to start because the spark plugs were fouled with damp. And then, in late November, came the cold. Not the cold of a Bavarian winter or a Channel autumn, the cold of Central Asia, sweeping westward in waves, dropping to -20, then -30, then, in the worst nights of January 1942, to -40, the temperature at which the Celsius and Fahrenheit scales agree and human beings frankly do not. The engine oil in your Daimler-Benz, designed for European temperatures, thickened to the consistency of cold honey. Hydraulic lines cracked, tires froze to the ground overnight and tore their tread when the aircraft was moved. Mechanics learned to drain the oil into buckets every evening, carry it inside, warm it on a stove, and pour it back in the morning. They learned to play blowtorches against the cylinder heads for half an hour before a start. You, the pilot, learned to dress in a fur-lined Canadair flight suit, fleece-lined boots, 2 pairs of gloves, a silk scarf wound twice around your neck, and to eat a breakfast of bread and pork fat and a small glass of schnapps, because the doctor, after a while, had quietly stopped pretending the schnapps was medicinal. It was in this country, this absurd and beautiful and merciless country, that a strange thing began to happen to the kill totals of certain German fighter pilots. The numbers, which had felt large at 30 in France and at 50 in the Channel battle, began to climb into territory that no one in any other air force in the world would ever reach. Werner Mulders, the great teacher, passed 100 victories and was promoted out of combat flying for political reasons, then died in November 41 in a transport aircraft crash on his way to a state funeral. Walter Novotny, a charming young Austrian, climbed past 200. Hermann Graf passed 200. Gerhard Barkhorn, a methodical, quiet Prussian, eventually reached 301. And a small, blonde, almost boyish young pilot from Württemberg named Erich Hartmann, who had joined his squadron in late 1942, with so little experience that the older men called him Booby. Little boy, slowly, methodically, and with an almost mathematical patience, climbed past 100, and then 200, and then 300. And finished the war with 352 confirmed aerial victories, the highest score of any fighter pilot in any war in human history. It is worth for a moment sitting quietly with that number, 352, more than the combined totals of the leading aces of Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union together. The reasons for this are not mostly mystical. The Eastern Front, in 1941 and 42, was a target-rich environment in a way no other theater ever was. The Soviet Air Force was huge, and through the early months, its pilots were appallingly undertrained, often with 30 or 40 hours of flying time before being thrown into combat. German pilots, by contrast, were rotated only when they were dead, wounded, or so exhausted they could no longer climb into a cockpit, which meant a man like Hartmann flew constantly 4, 5, 6 sorties a day for years. The Allied system, which sent its best pilots home to instruct after a tour or two, produced an air force in which the average pilot was good. The German system, which kept its best pilots in combat until the war ended, produced an air force in which a few pilots were extraordinary and the rest were, increasingly, beginners. By 1944, this would matter very much. In 1942, it was simply how it was. You, in the meantime, were not Hartmann. You were one of the much larger group of pilots of whom history has not bothered to keep track. The men who flew their 3 or 4 sorties a day, scored their 2 or 3 or 7 kills, and were eventually shot down themselves over a forest near Vyazma or a frozen lake outside Velikie Luki. You learned to read the white winter sun against silver birches, the dark blot of a Sturmovik low over a road, the muzzle flashes of partisans in a tree line. You learned the smell of a burning T-34, oil and rubber, and something else you tried not to think about. You learned to dread being shot down over partisan country, where rescue was a fantasy, and capture was something men spoke about in lowered voices and then changed the subject. You learned, slowly, that lice live in the seams of wool, that dysentery is mostly survivable, and that frostbite, if you were attentive, could be staved off by a thin film of goose fat smeared on your cheeks before flight. And then there were the airlifts, the two great moments when the Luftwaffe transport force, the Junkers 52s that had once dropped paratroopers on Norwegian airfields and Cretan villages, was asked to do something it could not quite do. The first was the Demjansk pocket in February of 42, where 6 German divisions were encircled in the snow, and the Junkers 52s kept them alive, just barely, for nearly 3 months, flying through blizzards into airstrips that were sometimes a single set of tracks in the white. It worked. Demjansk held. The pilots who survived were exhausted but proud, and Hermann Göring, who watched from Berlin, learned the wrong lesson, because then there was Stalingrad. In late November of 1942, the Sixth Army was encircled in the ruins of a city on the Volga, and Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply kit from the air, and the operation began. And it was not Demyansk. The pocket was bigger. The distances were longer. The weather was worse. The Soviets had learned. From makeshift bases at Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya, and finally retreating further west, General Martin Fiebig's Transport Command flew Junkers 52s and converted Heinkel 111s and even 4 in giant Fokker-Wulf Condors through blizzards into Pitomnik airfield, and, when Pitomnik fell, into Gumrak, a flattened strip lit at night by burning oil drums. The promised 300 tons a day became 100, then 60, then 40, then almost nothing. The transports took off, carrying ammunition and lard and powdered milk, and on the way back, frostbitten, wounded with eyes that had stopped tracking. Nearly 500 aircraft were lost. Whole training schools were stripped of their instructors to fly these missions, and most of those instructors did not come back. In late January of 1943, Pitomnik fell. On the 2nd of February, the Sixth Army surrendered. The Luftwaffe transport arm, the careful instrument that had been built up over a decade, was, for all practical purposes, finished. You went home. That spring, on a leave that the Reich called convalescent and that you privately understood was something else. And you walked through a small Bavarian town in which everything looked the same and nothing was the same. And you went back. There was a great offensive that summer, in early July of 43, a place called Kursk, where the Luftwaffe massed almost everything it had left in the east, and Stukas under Rudel destroyed Soviet tanks by the hundred, and German fighters claimed enormous totals over the salient, and at the end of 2 weeks the offensive had failed. And from that day forward, although you did not yet know it, the Luftwaffe in the east would only ever retreat. The grass strips you took off from in 1943 were 300 kilometers west of the ones you had used in 42. The strips of 44 would be 300 kilometers west of those, and somewhere far behind you, in a sky that was beginning to fill with a different kind of enemy, a 4-engined enemy with American voices and very, very long legs. The war you thought you were fighting was being replaced, quietly, by the war that would actually finish you. But before we follow that western sky to its conclusion, before the four-engined enemy and the long American legs and the contrails over Berlin, we have to slip south into a different kind of light. Because while you were freezing into your seat on a Russian airfield outside Vyazma, other pilots in other uniforms in the same Air Force were peeling off their fleece jackets, sweating through their shirts, and watching the sun come up over a sea so blue it almost did not look real. Because the Luftwaffe, by the early months of 1941, was no longer a one-front affair. It had become, somewhat reluctantly, a Mediterranean power. The story really begins in January of 1941, when Flieger Corps 10 under General Hans Geisler was transferred from northern Norway, of all places, down to airfields on Sicily, around Comiso and Catania and Trapani, with orders to do something the Italians had so far conspicuously failed to do, which was to close the central Mediterranean to British shipping and to bomb the small, stubborn island of Malta into something resembling submission. The pilots who arrived in Sicily that January, many of them straight from snow squalls over the North Sea, climbed out of their Junkers 88s into a kind of soft southern morning that smelled of lemons and dust, and were billeted in farmhouses with terracotta floors and walls a meter thick and pretty. Suspicious women in black, who served them strong coffee and small bitter olives, and watched them carefully from doorways. Their first major piece of work came almost immediately. On the 10th of January 1941, Stukas of Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 and Sturzkampfgeschwader 2 attacked the British aircraft carrier, illustrious as she escorted a Mediterranean convoy, and in something like 10 minutes they put 6 bombs into her, set her ablaze, and very nearly sank her. She limped, smoking, into Malta, and the Mediterranean air war, which had been a leisurely Italian affair of biplanes and gentlemanly torpedoes, became something quite different overnight. A month later, in February of 41, a small German general called Erwin Rommel landed at Tripoli with the first units of what would soon be the Afrika Korps, and the Luftwaffe followed him into a country that no German air force had ever been designed for. Jagdgeschwader 27 flew its Bf 109s onto a strip outside Ain el-Ghazala, and it is hard, even now, to imagine the bewilderment of a young Saxon pilot stepping out of the cockpit into a horizon of nothing but pale ochre sand and a sky that pressed down on him like a hot tin lid. The desert was, in many ways, the worst environment imaginable for a high-performance liquid-cooled fighter aircraft. The Daimler-Benz engines of the Bf 109 had been designed for the cool, damp air of Central Europe. In a Libyan summer, with cockpit temperatures climbing past 50 degrees Celsius on the ground, glycol coolant boiled, oil thinned, spark plugs fouled, the fine talcum-like sand of the western desert blew into every joint, every bearing, every filter. The mechanics fitted big, ugly bulges over the supercharger intakes. The so-called Tropen filter, which slowed the aircraft down and 8 horsepower, but kept the engines breathing. They painted the airframes in mottled patterns of yellow ochre and sand with pale blue undersides, and they parked them in shallow scrapes covered with camel thorn brush. The pilots lived in canvas tents pegged to the sand, with their boots tucked under the cot legs to keep the scorpions out, mosquito nets that did almost nothing against the flies, and the persistent, undignified company of dysentery, which the men called jippy tummy, and treated with a stoicism that had nothing in particular to recommend it. They ate Italian field rations, which were, depending on whom you asked, either tolerable or actively criminal. Tinned sardines packed in pale, oily liquid, rectangles of hardtack that had to be soaked before they could be chewed, little tins of meat called AM, the initials of which the Italians said stood for Amministrazione Militare, and the Germans said stood for Alter Man, old man, and the British said stood for things we cannot repeat in a sleep video. They drank water that arrived in old petrol cans and tasted faintly of petrol forever after, with a chemical edge of chlorine added at the well, and they brewed tea over little cookers because tea in the desert became a kind of sacrament for everyone, regardless of which side they were on. The airfields were not airfields in any European sense. They were strips of compacted sand, scraped flat by an Italian bulldozer, marked at the corners with empty fuel drums, and named after whatever Bedouin well or Italian fort or scattering of palm trees was nearest. Names that became, in the air war journals, almost incantatory. Gazala, Martuba, Tmimi, Derna, Tobruk West. The strips moved as Rommel moved. When the Afrika Korps advanced toward Egypt, the fighter wings advanced with it, leaving the Italians to take over the rear bases. When Rommel retreated, you packed your tent at 3 in the morning, lashed your kit to a Junkers 52, and flew west to a strip you had never seen before, where there was no water yet and the cooks had not arrived. It was in this peculiar, sun-bleached, half-archaic war, somewhere between a chivalric duel and a slow medical disaster, that Jagdgeschwader 27, under the quiet, decent leadership of Eduard Neumann, produced one of the strangest pilots the Luftwaffe ever saw. His name was Hans Joachim Marseille. He was a Berliner, the son of a general, charming, womanizing, indisciplined, half bohemian and half showman, with curling hair that he pomaded against regulations and a habit of arriving late to briefings smiling. He was also, by any measurable standard, the most extraordinary pure marksman in fighter aviation. While most pilots in any air force fired long bursts at low deflection angles, Marseille flew in tight, curving arcs at high deflection, the most difficult shooting in the world, and he placed a handful of cannon rounds into a vital point at 300 meters, while half inverted and pulling 4G. On one famous afternoon in September of 1942, he shot down 17 British and South African aircraft in a single day, with an average expenditure of fewer than 15 rounds per kill, which is the kind of statistic that even other pilots refuse to entirely believe. His superiors, who could not entirely stand him personally, gave him the Knight's Cross, then the oak leaves, then the swords, then the diamonds, the highest distinction the Wehrmacht had to offer. The German press called him the Stern von Afrika, the Star of Africa, and printed photographs of him grinning beside his yellow-nosed Bf 109. And he was, briefly, perhaps the most famous young man in Germany. On the 30th of September 1942, his engine caught fire on a routine flight back from the front. The cockpit filled with oil smoke. He held the aircraft long enough for his wingmen to clear away, rolled inverted and bailed out, and was struck by the tail surface and killed before his parachute opened. He was 22 years old. The Desert War was, in fact, full of moments like that. There was something about the cleanness of the horizon, the absence of villages and civilians and trees, that seemed to encourage a certain kind of mythology in which gentlemen pilots dropped messages and fresh laundry on each other's airfields, and the war was a kind of game between rival sporting clubs. There was a small element of truth to this, mostly between the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force's Desert Air Force, who genuinely did, on occasion, exchange POW lists and pleasantries by parachute. There was also, of course, an enormous amount of sand drifting over wreckage and burned bodies, and 20-year-olds with their faces smashed against an instrument panel. But that part did not photograph as nicely. Meanwhile, in the center of the Mediterranean, the Luftwaffe was doing its best to obliterate Malta. By the spring of 1942, Fliegerkorps II, under Bruno Lorza, was based on Sicily and flying continuous waves of Junkers 88s and Stukas against the island, which absorbed, in the months of March and April alone, more bombing than London had received in the entire Blitz. Pilots took off from Commerceau into the rising sun, climbed out over a sea so blue it hurt the eyes, watched the brown smudge of Malta come up beneath them, and tried not to think too hard about the curtain of British anti-aircraft fire that the gunners on Malta had become, by then, very, very good at putting up. Then in August came Pedestal, the British convoy operation that fought its way to Malta with the loss of 9 merchantmen and several warships, including the carrier Eagle. The Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica pummeled it for 4 days. Heinkel 111s of Kampfgeschwader 26, flying as torpedo bombers, came in low over the Sicilian Channel and put torpedoes into ship after ship, and lost crews you knew personally dead in 20 seconds when an Oerlikon caught their wing. There had also been Crete 15 months earlier, in May of 1941, the great airborne operation called Merkur, in which the German parachute force was dropped from Junkers 52s onto the airfield at Maleme and the towns of Heraklion and Rethymnon, and took the island, and lost so many of its best men in doing so that Hitler never again ordered a major airborne operation. The transport pilots who flew that mission remembered, mostly, the dust kicked up by hundreds of 52s taking off in sequence from Greek strips at 5 in the morning, the men in the doorways with their static lines clipped, the flak coming up from Maleme like dotted lines drawn on the air. By the autumn of 1942, the long Mediterranean tide began to turn. At El Alamein in October and November, Rommel's army was broken in the sand. On the 8th of November came Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in French Morocco and Algeria, which placed Allied air power directly behind the Africa course. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 27 and Jagdgeschwader 77, falling back across Libya, then across Tunisia, found themselves outnumbered by P-40 Warhawks, then by Spitfires, then by twin-tailed P-38 Lightnings, in a way they had never quite been before. The Mediterranean sun, which had once been theirs, now belonged to someone else. In May of 1943, the German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered. The fighter wings flew their last serviceable aircraft north to Sicily on the final morning, leaving smoking wrecks lined up beside the strips at Tunis and Bizerte, and on the 8th of September, the Italian government concluded an armistice with the Allies, and the Luftwaffe in the south, abruptly and quite alone, found itself trying to hold a peninsula it had not designed any plan to defend. The Salerno landings on the 9th of September, then Anzio in January of 44, came one after another. The fighter strips moved north from Sicily to Foggia to the Po Valley. The young pilots arriving as replacements in 1943 had 30 hours less training than the ones they replaced, who had themselves had 30 hours less than the ones before them. You, if you survived the desert, came home through Italy in 1943, And you walked along a beach near Rimini one evening, where the sea was the color of olive oil and the sky was the color of a peach, and you understood, in a quiet way that you did not say out loud, that the southern half of the war was over, and that whatever was coming next was going to come from a different direction altogether, from the cold north, with 4 engines, and would not stop until everything you knew was burning. That different direction was, of course, the west, and it announced itself with the steady, mechanical, almost agricultural drone of 4 engined American bombers crossing the German coast in daylight, hour after hour, day after day, in numbers that, by the spring of 1943, had begun to feel less like a campaign and more like a kind of weather. The United States Army Air Forces, flying B-17, flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators out of cold, muddy fields in East Anglia with names like Thurley and Molesworth and Bassingbourn, had committed itself to a doctrine that no one else had quite been mad enough to attempt. They were going to bomb Germany in the daytime, in tight defensive boxes, without long-range fighter escort, and they were going to keep doing it until something gave way. For a while, what gave way was them. You, by then, were no longer a young man having adventures in France or in the desert. You were a tired man in your late 20s, with a thin, hard mouth, who had been flying since 1940, who had 3 or 4 close friends still alive, and who flew now from a base inside the Reich itself, somewhere like Wiesbaden-Erbenheim or Jever or Rhine, with cabbage fields out to the perimeter wire and a village church visible above the trees. Your aircraft was a Bf-109 G6, the Gustav with bulges over the cowl guns that the men called Bjorn lumps, because they were lumps, and a 30mm Mark 108 cannon, firing through the propeller hub, a weapon so brutal that 2 or 3 hits could take a wing off a fortress. Or you flew a Focke-Wulf 190A8 in its Sternbock variant, an assault fighter weighed down with extra armor around the cockpit and bolt-on cannons under the wings, with which you were expected, by direct order, to close to point-blank range against the bomber boxes and not break off until you had killed something or been killed. Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader